Now, the government wants to change parts of the Gambling Act. One of the issues under the consideration is what tax should be paid on gambling. Draft legislation is expected to be published in the next few months. But what is the situation right now, and how is it expected to change? And of course, what can we learn from other countries' gambling legislation? Botha from Cliff Decker Hofmeyer Attorneys joins me now to break this down for us further. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Let's perhaps start with that very question and give us some context on what exactly this gambling tax means.
Right. So, to give a bit of history, back in 2011, in the budget review, it was initially announced there was a proposal that there would be a so-called withholding tax on winnings above 25,000 Rand. The purpose stated at the time was to discourage excessive gambling by people gambling. A year later from that, that idea was shelved, and instead what was mooted then was to impose a so-called tax or a levy on the gross gambling revenues of gambling operators. Nothing came of that too. Now 7 years on, in 2019, in the latest budget review, the minister mentioned again, made reference back to the 2012 proposal and said that during the course of this year, legislation would be introduced to impose such a levy.
So are you saying that the levy did not exist before on gambling winnings at all?
So not from a national perspective. So currently, each of South Africa's provinces has provincial gambling legislation. So just for example, in the Western Cape and Gauteng, there's gambling legislation, and each set of legislation separately states what casinos or gambling operators in those provinces would have to pay, or the percentage of tax that they would have to pay on their gross gambling revenue.
I know one company, Pumelela, wasn't too happy about the legislation process in Gauteng when it comes to that, and that brings me to my next question about how exactly it would affect businesses operating within the industry.
Well, obviously, in the current economic environment, in principle, no additional tax is going to be welcomed, I think, by the industry. Of course, the purpose behind the tax, as was announced, is to prevent or to create greater awareness of the possible negative effects of excessive gambling. We have seen instances in the news where, gambling addiction has caused negative effects to people's lives and so on. And obviously, there is the aim of creating awareness, but for the gambling industry in itself, it might not be ideal. The one thing we have to see is how exactly the tax will be imposed. It may be, for example, that it's only on the actual gambling revenue. So if you're a casino, for example, and your revenue comes from various sources, partly gambling, hospitality, and so forth, it's only the gambling portion, for example, that may then be subject to this tax.
Now, in your report, you make reference to the UK and the legislation that's there. An interesting one here called the non-negotiable chips, so the tax treatment of non-negotiable chips. First, explain that really, and what we can learn in terms of best practice when it comes to legislating these policies.
Right, so basically in the UK, they have the legislation there is called the Finance Act, which then imposes a so-called gaming duty, which is based on also the gross gaming revenue received by the casino, by the gamer, less winnings. And so essentially what happened a few months ago, there was a case there as to whether certain so-called non-negotiable chips form part of these winnings or should be taken into account in determining the revenue. So by way of example, a person might spend, it's usually the UK currency too, they might spend £1,000 on gambling. Because they spend £1,000, they might receive £10 back in so-called non-negotiable chips. And the question that then there arose in a case was whether the spending of that £10 in chips, should that amount be added again to the revenue on which the casino is taxed. So instead of being taxed only on the 1,000 that was spent, they'd be taxed on the other 10 that the person received in chips. And in a specific case there, it was held by the UK court that no, that they should not be taxed on the 10, again, because it can only be used for gambling, and normally the casino wouldn't include it for accounting purposes.
Yeah, and then just a final thought from you. How long till we see this legislation put in place in terms of implementation here in South Africa?
Well, assuming it's released with the tax legislation or the draft tax legislation that's released every year, it should come out in the next 2 to 3 months. Typically, the legislative process goes something like this. You have your draft legislation released in about June, July. Typically there'd be a month or 2 month period for comments. Comments would then be received, and then based on the comments, there'd be a decision made whether to go ahead with the tax, and then it might come into effect, say, early next year. That's usually the legislative cycle that is followed for our tax legislation.
Yeah, and if it's put in place, it's a little bit of extra revenue for our revenue service, I guess. Thank you so much for your time, Louis. I've been speaking there to Louis Botha of Cliff Decker Hofmeyer Attorneys. Now, what will the weather hold for the rest of the week?